So I'm going to go ahead and start because I do want us to, we're going to need to be cognizant of time. I'm going to rush through a lot of stuff about our history, not because it's, but just because I promised 15 minutes. And so this is basically going to be a few things, seeds planted about our story, and hopefully some of them will interest you. And if they do, I'll be glad to talk more or point you to all sorts of historical documents for later. Primarily, this document that we really need to reprint, this is a history of Holy Trinity at its centennial, which was 1992. And the woman who was the primary author of that is still here. Belinda Watkins was the primary writer, although a lot of other people were involved. But this does a great job of telling the history from 1892 to 1992. So I'll be relying on a lot of this, and I've got a PDF version of it on my computer, so I'm happy to email it to anybody who would like. I'm just going to tell kind of a straight narrative story of the history, broken into a few eras. And the first one is just a beginnings era. And that would be from 1892, when we were founded, to 1925. One of the reasons that's an important era for the Episcopal Church, those of you who know that era know that the United States was growing like crazy during that time. From 1880 to 1920, we grew from about 50 million citizens to 150 million citizens. And the Episcopal Church grew a lot during that time. You can, in fact, if you look around, at least on the East Coast especially, if you look around at when Episcopal churches were founded, you'll find a lot of them were founded in that 40-year period. There was a neat statistic in here. In 1830, one person in 416 was an Episcopalian in the United States.
Wow.
In 1906, one in 95 people were a member of the Episcopal Church. Now, I suspect those numbers would be interesting if you looked at who got to be counted as a citizen and all that. But still, I think it's clear that there was a lot of the growth of the Episcopal Church. So we were founded in that time, 1892, as a worshiping community by some families who came from St. Luke's in Atlanta. There were 13 families on the original list of church planters, and it took off pretty well pretty quickly. In 1893, the very next year, they purchased a plot of land for $700 and planted the first church, First Holy Trinity there. That church was then purchased or built that same year for, I think it was $900. And this is it. So this is a picture of our painting of our first church building. This property, which looks so, adorable and foresty, is now Phillips Tower. Those of you who know Phillips Tower. So, during that time, it was a collection of visiting clergy. It wasn't about the priests, right? It was about the community. From 1892 to 1905, it was visiting clergy, and then there were a series of sort of short-term clergy who came until 1923. And that leads us to what I'm calling like the first period of stability. We're about almost 30 years old. From 1923 to 1944, a period of stability, but also a period of great loss. And I'm sorry, this is so clergy-centric, but this is the way the history gets written, and it's not really the true history, but it's the one we got. In 1923, y'all called your first long-term rector. This was a man named Mr. Charles Holding, who was from England, but served in the United States. And he was here from 1923 till 1944. So, what is that? 21 years. He's remembered as a very fine pastor, but he went through some very difficult seasons in Holy Trinity's life. I'll show you a picture that doesn't look difficult, just because it's a great picture. This is a gathering of the group, and there's a bunch of kids, little kids here, and the adults in the back. Here's Mr. Holding. I don't know when exactly this was, but sometime in that period. And I'll tell you my favorite little piece of trivia, for those of you who know Anne Franzen. Anne Franzen remembers Mr. Holding, who left here in 1944. She's our oldest, not the oldest in terms of her age, but the oldest in terms of length of membership. She was born and raised here. During that time, we outgrew that first building and bought new land over here. They started with what they called a parish house, a 2-story building. There was some discussion that it was meant to be the first phase of a cruciform building, that like this would be the first building was the arms, and then they would build the base later. But because it was going to be the short-term solution, they put the worship space on the second floor, and there were no elevators. So that meant that when you had a funeral and you had a casket, up the stairs with the casket. The problem was this just a few years plan didn't take into account the Depression. So when the Depression hit, as y'all know, everything just kind of fell apart. And from 1929 up until the late 30s, maybe early 40s, it wasn't clear that Holy Trinity was going to survive. We were not making even interest-only payments on the mortgage. We were paying a fraction of the salary of Mr. Holding. There's a great and terrible quotation that Mr. Holding told a group of people there was no need to go out and evangelize because nobody would ever want to live in Decatur, because during the Depression things were just that grim. But he stayed, and the community stayed, and they hung in, and things started to turn around. Mr. Holding resigned in the fall of 1944, took a call to a church in Greensboro, South Carolina, and sadly died in the year 1950, so not long after leaving here. Following this season came the next, what I would call the great age of American church, 1945 to about 1965. Unprecedented growth in church attendance, in the building of church buildings, in the trust in the church as an institution. It was, of course, tied to all of the great expansion in the United States, the elation after the terrible tragedies of World War I and World War II. And Holy Trinity lived that out almost just like the script told it to. In 1945, they called a new rector, a strapping 29-year-old man from Louisiana named Harry Tisdale, who is right here. When you hear somebody say, we're meeting in the portrait room, it's the room where his portrait is, which is where our food was tonight. Harry showed up right as this burst of optimism and growth was coming, and that's not to say that he nor the people of Holy Trinity weren't amazing and faithful. It just means that was part of the spirit of the age. There was phenomenal growth here during that time. The parish grew from 440 communicants in 1945 to 1,045 communicants in 1961. In 1948, they burned the mortgage on that 2-story building and immediately started a new building campaign to build a new church, which is now Tisdale Hall. In 1951, they planted St. Michael and All Angels in Stone Mountain. In 1954, they planted Holy Cross in Decatur and St. Bartholomew's over on La Vista Road in Atlanta. In 1951, this is where it's just like made up numbers. In 1951, there were 1,292 people who attended 4 Easter services for that day on Easter Sunday. And that church held 230 people. So they were jammed in. In 1950, I should wait for Ellen to get back because she's just started her new Bible study class. But in 1950, a Bible class of 175 people met over at Glenwood Elementary School. And they had 584 people enrolled in Sunday school in 1950. By 1955, that number was 893 people enrolled in Sunday school. Easter of 1956, there were 1,400 attendees across 5 services. And so this new church that was just built in 1951, I think it was already obsolete, and there was discussion to build a $400,000 Gothic structure that would seat 600 people. In 1957, we built an education building, which is now the Comer Center, and just a string of clergy who came through the doors. Harry, this was back before we had committees. Harry would like grab you and say, "You're going to seminary and you're going to come work, and I'll tell the bishop," and blah, blah, blah. You know, I'm exaggerating, but only a little. Names like, and these may not mean anything to you, but they do to me, and I know they would to Chuck and a few of us. Bob Bailey, Austin Ford, who started Emmaus House, Jerry Zeller, Charlie Roper, who was at Holy Cross for years, Herb Smith, Charles Taylor, Ian Franzen's brother. Bishop Frank Allen got started when he was an Emory student, and Harry grabbed him around the collar and told him he was going to come work for him. I was telling Ellen, not to make you, either of us, feel too terrible or inferior or whatever, but your new Bible study class can only compete with the 1950 Bible class of 175 people over at Glenwood Elementary School. To say nothing of the 893 people enrolled in Sunday school in 1955.
The Christian century.
The Christian century. In 1963, Harry Tisdale resigned as rector after 18 wonderful years. He retired on disability. He suffered from what they thought was rheumatoid arthritis. His oldest son, Chet, now thinks it was something slightly different. But and the story that I think is so illustrative of Harry, a couple of them. He comes in 29 years old. There's a great story about him playing baseball out in the churchyard with a couple of the younger men, and somebody hits a baseball through one of the windows, and he says, "Just tell them I did it, it'll be fine." Only 18 years later, at, what is that, 39, 49, 48-ish, he's retiring on disability. He has to have 2 walking sticks to get down the aisle for the procession. Altars used to be exclusively up against the wall, and it was a big deal when you pulled it out. Apparently, Harry pulled the altar out from the wall so that he could put a stool back there to sit, because he just couldn't stand long enough to say the Mass, and laughed about it. And then he went on to just amazing things. If you get a chance, read Bishop Bennett Sims's funeral sermon of Harry that is printed and on that credenza under his portrait. It is the finest funeral sermon I've ever heard. I've also had an audio recording, but it's the finest one I've ever read or heard, and it's the shortest also, which don't tell anybody that there's a connection there. After Harry left, Holy Trinity went through a period of great changes, as did the country. This was, we're moving into the 60s. The era of the golden age of church is ending, but nobody knows it. They think it's going to continue on, but things start to change. Some of the big forces, as we know, the question of equality of women, the civil rights movement. Later, we'd get into the questions around sexuality, but all kinds of, those are the big obvious ones, the evangelical movement. Those are the big ones that are affecting the church, but there's all kinds of things going on, and we again kind of embody that. The next priest was a man named Bill Littleton, who was here for 3 years, what we now call an inadvertent interim. You follow somebody who's been here forever, and it turns out you're the sacrificial lamb. I also heard a story that Bill said he arrived and told the vestry, "We're going to build a school." And the vestry said, "No, we're not." And he said, "Thanks, folks." Now, I don't know if that's true, but it's a great story. I met Bill, actually, right before he died. He was in a retirement home in St. Simon's, and I got to go visit him. After Bill came a man named Jack Hopper. Jack Hopper was here from 1967 until 1976, and the kind of great story that I heard about Jack was when they called to kind of check references on him. They told Bill Probst, is who told me this story, because he tells all the stories, and some of them are even true. That they said, look, Jack's a great guy, he's a good priest. He's just led us through a big building campaign, but he's tired. He's got just a few more years before retirement. He just needs a quiet, stable time. And they said, quiet and stable sound great. We'll bring him in. 6 months later, this place burned to the ground.
Oh my goodness.
So in July of 1967, that two-story building, there was an electrical fire. It demolished that building and badly damaged what is now Tisdale Hall. It was at the time the worshiping space. And they had to figure out what to do. And it was traumatic. For 3 years, we worshiped over in the chapel at Decatur First Methodist. We hired Louis Swayze, an architect in Atlanta, to design a new building. And a big building campaign came about. Another great story, though, is that the day of the fire, everybody was here. There's still people here, like Louis, who were here when the fire occurred. And Vivian, you were here too, right? So Jack Hopper, here all of 6 months, probably feeling like, oh my God, how did I let this happen? Harry Tisdale, rector emeritus, gets rolled up in his wheelchair and says, Jack, how in the hell did you manage to do in 6 months what I couldn't get done in 18 years to get that damn building out of here? Which was a kindness to Jack, for sure. But they did have to do that, and they did, and this is an architect's rendering or artist's rendering of the buildings we now occupy. This building is meant to be what's called a modern interpretation of a cathedral, which you can probably see if you go up there and look at it with fresh eyes. And this is what is now called Tisdale Hall. Jack's years were not all that happy, to be honest. Russ Wallace of blessed memory said that his one stint on the vestry was spent being chaplain to Jack. His wife had a terrible illness, died shortly after these buildings were completed. The funeral was held upstairs. One of the first services in this chapel is named in her memory, Ruth Hopper. And his son was going through a tough time as well. And so I think Jack had a difficult time here, not because there was something wrong with the fit, it was just a hard time in his life. We moved into the 70s. This is Dick Milner, who was called as a curate, was here for a few years as the associate, and then when Dick left, they called him as rector, which is a big no-no in the Episcopal Church. You're not allowed to do it right up until the moment the bishop tells you you can do it. And, right, Chuck? Right, Ellen? But there's a price you pay for it. I mean, there's goodness in it. Like if something happened to me, I know half of y'all here would be like, let's get Ellen or Rhett to be the rector. And that there's a reason that sounds so wonderful, but there's a cost to it because you're changing roles so dramatically. And it was the 70s, and Dick was a complicated figure from what I've been able to know. He did a number of wonderful things. He brought in the use of the new prayer book. He lifted up lay pastoral care and did a lot of work around that. He lifted up women's roles in the church, although women had leadership roles before Dick Milner, but he did that. He left kind of in turmoil in 1979, but not before he was involved in our first woman being raised up for ordination to the priesthood from this parish, a woman named Bertie Pittman, who was our first ordained woman from this parish. After Dick left, it was a period of what I think of as a period of stabilization. The three next successive rectors all served basically 10-year periods. And thankfully, they all lined up perfectly with the decade, so it's easy to tell the story. Francis Daunt was here from 1980 to 1989. He's remembered, I think, he's still alive, but I mean, he's remembered here I think is a person who, his biggest lasting contribution is instituting the prayers at the rail, where people come up. He was, this was the season when the renewal movement was very big in the church. His only real blunder, of course, was the calling of some of his assistant clergy. Just a little cheap shot and not at all true. But he's remembered for a very, I think, a very nice temperament and spirit in the place. After his 10-year period, came a kind of another period of growth, not at all as dramatic as the one we saw in the 40s and 50s and early 60s with Harry Tisdale. But the 90s were a time of great growth in Decatur, and Holy Trinity was growing with them. Philip Linder was the rector, and you served with him, or you left right before?
6 months.
6 months, okay.
5 months.
But Philip brought a lot of renewed energy and growth and charisma to this place. The attendance really soared during his period. I think he's remembered very fondly. He called the first woman to serve here, Dina Cleaver Bartholomew, and was served basically all of the 90s. And then after he left, he went to go to the cathedral in South Carolina, and then had a really tumultuous, in a good way, well, in a partially good way, a really tumultuous time fighting some fights that he thought needed to be fought. But he paid a price for it, and now he's found some nice peace. He's in Charleston and serving as canon of the ordinary in Charleston for the renewed diocese in South Carolina. Then my immediate predecessor came and served from 2000 to 2010, Bill Denicky. Bill Denicky, I think, and more of you were here during his time, really brought a renewed focus on spirituality. Icon writing was very big. He brought a renewed focus on environmental concerns and environmental advocacy. Our solar panels came during that time. And I think, not that anybody wanted to do this, but I think his biggest contribution was that he led this parish, along with a lot of wonderful lay leadership, through the schisms and arguments and debates over homosexuality and the full equality of gay and lesbian folks in the church. That's one of those things you don't get a lot of credit for, and you never put down on one of your goals to go when people are about ready to kill each other, but they didn't here. They didn't do that here, and that's because of Bill and Ellen and Joanna and a lot of y'all here. And then after Bill left in 2010, the place just went to hell, man. I don't know, I'll leave y'all to that, but I'll leave you with one more fun picture.
Greg, before you leave Bill, you should say Bill's influence in your life and my life.
Yeah, so one of Bill's, outside of the parish ministries, was overseeing people discerning calls for the priesthood and walking us through those discernment times. And both Ellen and I spent about a year under Bill's leadership having long meetings talking about... In the Gaylord Room.
Hours and hours in the Gaylord Room.
This is a 2002 Sunday, Sunday school kickoff picture in what is now Tisdale Hall. And it was about to be renamed and dedicated as Tisdale Hall. But, and Bill still lives here in Decatur, and he and I get lunch from time to time, and he's just a dear man. So that is a rush through 130-something years of history, but do let me know if you want your own copy of this. I can send you a PDF, and if you want to talk more, I'm always happy to talk. Stephanie?
Is there in the Episcopal Church a certain period of time a rector should stay at a parish?
No. No, there's some common knowledge, but it always changes depending on who you talk to.
Isn't he amazing? Oh my God.
12 years, 9 months. Oh, you're going to use that.
Since I'm channeling Barbara, I'm just going to channel her.
Oh, you're up next, sorry.
Yeah, that's right.
You want me to do that? We can do our Sunday.
Yeah.
Well, no,
Oh, you got it.
no, I don't. This is when I say, Dad.
For there are a variety of gifts.
And
Some of
this
us
is-
know microphones.
This is not mine. All right. So I'm Ellen, but tonight I am going to be channeling a member of this parish, Barbara Ramsey. How many of you know Barbara? Yeah. She usually sits right there. So if you don't know Barbara and her husband Ernie, come to 8 o'clock sometime and sit with Barbara and Ernie and get to know them, and you'll be glad that you did. So when Greg and Rhett and I were talking about the history of this parish, I knew, of course, that Greg needed to do his amazing flyby through the history of this place because he knows it so well. And then the next thing that we talked about was offering a history of the spirituality of this parish, the spiritual life of this parish. Some of you have heard Father Greg say this is a spiritually mature parish. And so when we were wondering how we might share about that, we thought of Barbara and said, oh, she would be the perfect person to come and talk about all of it. Unfortunately, Barbara really doesn't get out at night these days, and so what we decided was that she and I would have an interview. I would have some questions for her, and I would take copious notes, and then with her gracious permission, be able to share with you some of what she said. So just imagine that I'm Barbara Ramsey, which maybe I'll be in my third or fourth life. But so the first question that I asked her had to do with what Father Greg says, that this is a spiritually mature parish. And so I asked Barbara, what would you say that means, and how that might have come to be? And Barbara said, yes, this is a spiritually mature parish. And that the reason for that has to do with the parish being open over the years in conversations, many conversations with one another, and with our outlook, that people voice their doubts, their strengths, their victories. And I love this phrase. She said that has woven us into a sturdier fragment. A sturdier fragment. Sturdier fabric, excuse me, I'm so sorry, sturdier fabric. And I said, well, can you talk about some examples of those conversations? And she said, oh yes, I can. And that the important conversations that strengthened the fabric had to do with some of the trials of the parish, which Greg already has alluded to. And one that I did not even think about with Holy Trinity. How many of you know that the Episcopal Church in America used to do communion once a month? Yeah. And what did we do the other 3 Sundays? Morning prayer, right? And I think there's still a few morning prayer parishes around.
More and more now.
In Virginia there are, and yeah. And so that was a real challenge when the church decided to make the practice communion 4 times a month and not once a month. The new prayer book, the 79 prayer book, and those of you who are Episcopalian will remember there was a zebra book, and there was a green
book,
a green book,
blue book.
A blue book. So there were these trial prayer books, but it was not the 1928 prayer book. It was not the 1928 prayer book. There was a new hymnal, the 1982 hymnal. I don't know what those fights were about, but does either of you know?
The fights were not as much about the hymnal as the prayer book, I think.
Yeah, yeah. And then of course, ordaining women was a big one. The inclusion of LGBTQ plus people, a big one. And Barbara said that this parish dealt with all of those challenges very openly, and that is what made this parish stronger. There was mutual understanding that came out of those conversations. There was an increase of faith. And of course, me being me, I said, well, what did that look like? What did that look like, Barbara? And she said, well, it looked like the rector saying, this is what we're going to do. This is what the bishop has decided we're going to do. This is what's going to happen. And then the conversations would begin. And even with folks who were ambivalent to resistant about some of these changes and challenges and transitions, people would have their say, that they would voice how they felt, what they thought. And this was interesting. Barbara said she didn't remember any official meetings or gatherings. That was her memory, but that there were these unofficial conversations that were strong conversations. And she said people were not silenced and they were not secretive. And I said, you mean they didn't have the meeting after the meeting in the parking lot? And she said, no. And so, one other thing about that, and I thought this was an interesting point about leadership. She said that in her estimation, the strongest leaders in this parish, clergy and lay, were for these changes in the life and practices of the church. And I said, well, why do you think that was? And she said, I think that those strong leaders understood that it was okay to trust the Spirit in moving to new places. And I asked her, well, what did everybody else do who didn't feel that way? And she said, ultimately people left. And, some of you will remember as recently as the ordination of our first gay bishop that, people left and went and found church homes in other places, and that was okay. Those strong leaders saw those changes as being faithful. That's what Barbara said. So I did next ask Barbara about the prayers at the rail, and they were indeed begun by Francis Daunt. This was in the mid-1990s?
80s.
Mid-1980s, okay. He had experienced them in a smaller parish, and this was a quote from Barbara, and felt they had worthy results. And so the vestry approved that, and so that practice began here, and it's been ongoing. And I still am not aware of another Episcopal church in this diocese that offers the prayers at the rail.
Marion Mossers used to.
Yeah, where you were, used to. So it is a very special and meaningful part of our worship together. And so I asked Barbara, how does it help the spiritual life of this parish that we have those prayers? And she said that she felt that they draw the parish together. They make people that you don't know real to you. You are participating in those prayers with them, and that binds you together, even if that's not somebody whom you know. She called them a faith builder, offering a window into a person's life. 9 times out of 10, she said, you can sit for years by somebody in church and not know them, and that she herself finds the participation in those prayers really, really valuable for her own spiritual life. An interesting thing she said was that apparently people sometimes have come back to the rail to offer thanksgiving for answered prayer, and I don't know how much that happens with us right now. I'm not remembering that, but something to think about, because she feels like that is really important as well. She told a little story on Bishop Frank Allen, who's now with Jesus, and the fact that after he and his wife Elizabeth came here to worship after he had retired, that he hated the prayers at the rail. Hated them. He said they were not liturgical or helpful, and that they were a waste of time. And
That sounds like a bishop.
doesn't that sound like Bishop Allen? Yes, yes, yes. He was an introvert, but when he spoke, he did not mince words. And so eventually they left.
Yeah.
They left. So I don't know what that tells you, but none of us has to agree about everything. I think the final thing I want to say about those prayers at the rail, she said, you know, in terms of our formation, they just make us brothers and sisters. They make us brothers and sisters, and I love that. So, hang on. So 2 more questions, and then we're gonna, Chuck Giordano and I are gonna have some fun. So I asked her to talk about a personal experience in her own spiritual life associated with this parish, and she talked about a movement that came about in the early 1970s called Faith Alive. And again, if you remember what Father Greg was saying about that tumultuous time in this country's history, it was an unsettled time, was her word. Vietnam, civil rights movement, women entering the workforce, all those things. And so, and the evangelical movement, charismatic movement that was happening in my Methodist church during that time. I remember my minister baptized somebody in a swimming pool, which was unheard of. So Barbara and Ernie, and then some other couples in the parish, Tish and Russ Wallace, Belinda and Ed Watkins, and a couple, the Carters.
Bill and Ann.
And they're both deceased?
Bill's still living.
Okay, thank you. So they participated in this movement. And it sort of reminded me a little bit about sort of like what do you call it in the Methodist Church? Camp meeting, or some kind of revival, where this team would come to your parish for 6 weeks, and then out of that worship and prayer time would come these small groups. And here's why I want to tell you about this. Because those small groups that arose in this parish were really, really powerful and important to the people who participated in them. And the 4 couples I just mentioned do not meet regularly as a prayer group, but they are bound together as spiritual brothers and sisters for life. And that's been going on since 1972.
Wow.
Yeah, it's amazing. So she just said that for all of those small groups, it really enabled parishioners to get to know one another and share the most intimate parts of their lives with one another in a place where there was a lot of trust. And I'm just remembering what you all are saying about the desire to get to know one another more deeply and in more meaningful ways. And so now you know there is some history here about ways to do that. And then the last thing I asked Barbara, what is your desire or prayer for Holy Trinity Parish? And she said, well, it's the same thing as for me. For faith to be deepened and enlarged. For faith to be deepened and enlarged. That more people become aware and experience the need for deeper spirituality, because it undergirds and sustains my life. It keeps me on an even keel. I'm quoting her now. It gives her a sense of peace. And she thinks 99% of people in the world need freedom from anxiety. So, those are words from Saint Barbara. And again, if you don't know Barbara and Ernie, come to 8 o'clock and meet them. And you will be glad you did. Thank you, Barbara. I learned so much. All right, so we are Father Girardeau is our closer. He's our closer. And I thought it would be really cool to have Chuck come and talk to me. We're just going to do a little Q&A and we'll see how it goes. Because Chuck was a priest here, and now he's here. He and Susie are here in retirement, and
I'm gonna sit.
have a seat. Okay.
Just a second.
Okay. Oh my, he's technologically proficient too.
No.
That's
Greg
so
showed all of his
impressive.
pictures. I've got to show you all a picture.
This
This is Philip Linder, myself, and my parents on my goodbye luncheon.
Aww.
And February of February of 1991.
I was gonna say 92, but it's 91.
Over at the very end of Tisdale Hall. I think I've sent this to you. And Mom and Dad are there. So that's evidence that I was here. You had any doubts? Okay.
All right, so Chuck, my first question, which you already know, is that you and Susie decided to come here to worship after your retirement. Why did y'all decide to do that?
Okay, first let me say Susie's not here tonight because she had cataract surgery yesterday. Y'all can hear me?
Yeah.
And she still feels very blurry.
Yeah.
Why did we decide to come here? Between the time that I retired from full-time parish ministry in June of 2014 and my arrival here, I did a lot of supply work around the diocese. I did a couple of part-time positions, and as you do that, when you walk into a parish, you begin, even when you get to the parking lot, you begin to get a sense of what a parish is about. Something that hadn't changed, and we'll get to that, but something that hadn't changed is the parking issue here. It's not your fault. But so when I quit doing supply work in the fall of 2019, Susie said to me, can we please settle somewhere long enough to have a church home? And then if you want to go back and do supply work, you can do that, and I can go worship. I don't have to follow you all around the diocese. I've visited at least 22 parishes from my count, and several of them several times. But you can begin to get a sense of the parish when you walk in the door. even with this collar on, you can look around. Is the narthex clean? Is it cluttered? Or what about the greeters? What about the people giving out the service bulletins? And I had not been to a Sunday service since I left here. I was here from the spring of 1987 to the spring of 1991, and I don't know. I see faces that I know, but I had not been to a Sunday service here. Been to a couple of funerals, and when we walked in the door, well, first thing that impressed me was all the parking spaces, handicapped parking spaces. Susie is movement impaired, and there were an awful lot of parking spaces out here in that parking lot, which said folks don't have to walk from Glenwood School over or wherever. We were still wearing masks. This was the spring of 2022. We were still wearing masks, but the greeting and the welcoming and the warmth, the masks didn't block. From the time we walked in the door until the time we walked out of the door. And we enjoyed the service. We were going to do some church shopping. The last time I did a supply Sunday was middle of January 2020, and that was it. We were going to find a church home. Well, the pandemic hit. And so we played hooky and enjoyed coffee and donuts and fell in love with CBS Sunday Morning, which we now record, and watch when we get home from Holy Trinity. But it felt that way. And I didn't really know you. I mean, I knew who you were, and I didn't know Brett. He was a new priest, and you weren't here yet. And it just felt good. It also should be noted that my wife was worshiping here in 87 to 91. We were married to two different people. We'd known each other from childhood, and our daughter, had been baptized here. So in some ways it was the first place we wanted to check out. Well, the bottom line, it was the last place we checked out. The music was incredible. I served for a while at All Saints downtown, which has a monumental music budget. The music in this place, the first time we were here, equaled what I'd experienced at All Saints. And that was impressive. Even as we were coming out of the pandemic, it was music, and it was good music, and it was diverse music. It was all sorts and conditions of music. It was Celtic Alleluia and the contemporary Alleluia, and it was just music. And there are only a few faces from those days here. And so we enjoyed that service so much that we decided we'd come back the next week. The preaching was pretty good that day too. And that's what we hear about more than anything else is music and preaching when it comes to liturgy. And the liturgy was good. Despite what Bishop Allen may have thought about the prayers. I did carry that away from here. And at Mary and Martha's in Beaufort, Georgia, where I served for 10 years, we did those prayers. A little differently, but we still did them. And so we came back, and each time we came back, somebody else greeted us with warmth and welcome. And we'd only been here a month or two, and I maybe said something to you or to Red, that my wife was having some surgery. And lo and behold, 2 days after she came out of the hospital, here was a layperson with altar flowers at our house. And we'd only been here a month. And that was only the first of about 3 visits like that we got in the first year that we were here. The strong lay participation in pastoral care spoke volumes. I'd like to think that precedes, it's just part of what has been here. And it does feel like home. I've always loved the nave upstairs, where the windows from that building were transposed into this poured concrete structure that was erected, and it brought the architecture of the 50s or whenever, and the architecture of this building. And it's a wonderful wedding of architectures. And it also felt like home. And so we didn't go anywhere else. And the preaching continues to be great, the music continues to be great. The longer we're here, the more we realize spiritually mature parish. I just got ahead of myself. But those words are what I've been trying to articulate this last week or so, as to the quality, as to why I will stay here. It's mature, spiritually mature parish, with great people and great care for people.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. We're so glad you're here.
It's good to be here.
So, I'm glad you gave the dates of when you were here. So 87 to 91. I think I phrased the question, what's changed since you were here? And then you were gonna talk about what's the same. So I just offer you both of those questions.
Okay. And the next one is about people. The biggest thing that's changed is there's a woman consistently behind the altar or in the pulpit. That's the biggest thing. Bertie Pittman may very well have been raised up out of this congregation early on. Dick Milner was here. But when I arrived here in '87, one of the things, Francis Daunt was the rector when I got here. One of the things Francis said to me is, we've got to be working on, and there was, as you pointed out, lots of women leading things here, but not behind the altar. And we went and looked in the service register. There had only been half a dozen maybe women here behind the altar that I'm aware of before I arrived here. And that was true throughout my tenure. Francis left in 1990, and I, blow my horn a little bit, I broke that pattern. There was a Maggie Harney. I don't know if you know Maggie. Maggie was looking for an altar, and she came and I said, sure, let's put you in the rota. And I got grief for it. It was an interesting time. I was named priest in charge, but it didn't mean that I was in charge of anything other than liturgy and pastoral care. The vestry and the senior warden, as is canonical, ran everything else. But the bishop allowed me to stay, and allowed me to have the title priest in charge, which is different than what it means today, very different. But I kind of knew Maggie and wanted to break the mold, and that's part of what an interim, I wasn't interim, but I was still the interim. That's part of what somebody does in that transition. And I got feedback on that. I got some pushback on it, but we broke it. And the biggest thing that's different now is that this place, that's the first thing, is that there is a woman behind the altar. In 1987, this place was not as open as it is to LGBTQ plus people, or at least not to them being out of the closet. And that's one of the things that's very different here. It feels like a much more inclusive and warm community to all God's children. In fact, there were people who kind of hid in the corners in those days, which made me greatly sad. And the other things that are different have to do with building and arrangement. And Trinity House, there was the house that was torn down was purchased while I was here.
It was torn down while I was here.
It was, and yeah, the elevator was put in while I was here. In fact, while Francis was leaving, they were putting this elevator in. Can you imagine making these 3 stories without an elevator? And the other thing that's different is the way the Comer Center is used. It was just a concrete block building built in 1957, is that what I heard? And it was kind of back there somewhere. There was a women's shelter here for children, and Dean was on the bottom floor, so that's still the same. But it was kind of the redheaded stepchild of a building, and we sort of avoided it. The shelter would close at 7 a.m. and then you could come back, and Sundays people converted the shelter rooms over to classrooms. What is most important is, and there's not a better way to say it, it's a spiritually mature parish, led not just by the clergy, but led by a whole group of committed lay people who care and who are committed to the ministries of this place. Yeah, I think that's good.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great through line. Yeah.
We have 1 minute.
Okay.
We have 1
Oh,
minute.
you have 1 minute. All right. I still get to ask you this question.
Okay.
So we hear a lot about how people have been influenced by clergy in their lives, and I want to turn that around and ask you, as a clergy person, to talk about a person who really influenced you as a priest.
Can I talk about 2 real quick?
You can talk about 2 real quick.
One is Francis Dawn. Francis taught me how to be a parish priest in a spiritually mature parish. I left here and became an assistant at Holy Innocents, and then I went off and, crazy enough, went to a startup congregation worshiping in a funeral home. And as we grew, the things that I had learned here about being a priest of a healthy, hopefully healthy congregation, I carried with me. Francis is the best rector I worked for. Good heavens, I can't, probably Betty and Tommy Thompson. But then I could go to lots of other people. Esther and Terry Price, who ran the kitchen. Betty and Tommy were the flower folks, of course. But Betty and Tommy, their attitude about living and the things that they faced and was faith-filled and optimistic, from my experience, and joyous. And Francis had a gift of finding people and placing or letting them have responsibilities where they would shine and where they had a ministry.
Oh, that's great.
And I could go on the list, Sonny and Pete Withers, and just going on.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Can they let you